so in this video we're going to look at a few flight planning questions, and we'll specifically look at questions around takeoff mass and landing mass and how that influences the aircraft's performance during takeoff and landing. Okay, so the very first one that we've got here is a question that is asking for the following. Determine the takeoff mass for the following single engine aircraft. And then they give you a few pieces of information. Your standard empty mass, 1,764 pounds, sorry. Optional equipment, 35 pounds. Pilot and front passenger is 300 pounds. Cargo mass, 350 pounds. Then your ram fuel, was also called your block fuel, is 60 gallons. Got to be careful of that because that's in gallons, not in pounds. And then your trip fuel is 35 gallons, same story. And then they give you the fuel density. If they don't, you can assume it's always 6 pounds to the gallon. Okay, so 1 gallon of fuel weighs 6 pounds in mass or weight. Okay, then your answer options, I've already circled the correct one. In this case, it's C, 2,809 pounds. So let me show you how to get to this. Now, the very first thing that you have to understand is, once you've looked at the information, I suggest you do this. Once you've looked at the information that they give you, go back to the question, just read the question again to understand exactly what it is that they're looking for. Okay, I see a lot of student pilots making this mistake. They start reading the question, they start digesting the information, but then they forget what they're actually, getting asked for. So go back once you've looked at the information and just read the question again. Determine the takeoff mass for the following single engine aircraft. So we need to determine what is the takeoff mass for this aircraft. Okay, so what do we start with? The very first one is the standard empty mass. Now, I'm not going to go into all of the different definitions for the different weights of an aircraft. That's another video that we can do. I'm going to just focus on the calculations in this one, but essentially standard empty mass is the weight of the aircraft standing there on the apron with just the necessary things to be able to operate. Okay, not including fuel and things like that. It's unusable fuel and oil and things like that in there, but that's basically the aircraft standing there. So in this case, the aircraft standing there on the apron, 1,764 pounds. Then there's optional equipment of 35 pounds. I don't know, maybe they've attached some other cool camera or whatever for survey work. So there's optional equipment in the aircraft, which is weighing 35 pounds. That's not part of standard empty mass. So we need to add that. Then there's the pilot and front seat passenger that's weighing 300 pounds. So we need to add that too, because remember, standard empty mass does not include the pilot and passengers or baggage or anything like that. And then cargo mass, also we need to add that. That's 350 pounds in this case. And then it's saying that our ram fuel, so the fuel that we have in the tanks, is 60 gallons. So now remember, like I've said, 6 pounds to the gallon. So we take 60 gallons, multiply that by 6, and that is going to tell us what that 60 gallons is actually weighing. And in this case, it's 360 pounds, if I've done my math correctly. Okay, so in other words, in the bigger scheme of things, what they're giving you here, like optional equipment, pilot and front seat passenger, cargo mass, and ram fuel, they're giving you one little extra piece of information, which is the trip fuel. And this is just to confuse you. And possibly also the optional equipment that they're giving you is also just to throw you off a little bit, because now you're like, should I add this or should I not add this? And I'm guaranteeing you now, if you don't add it, there's going to be an answer that will actually look right to you. So it's so important that when you do these calculations, that you really understand the definitions of what each of these weights mean. Okay, so optional equipment, we need to add pilot and front passenger, cargo mass, and the ram fuel we need to add. In this case, the trip fuel, I'll make it red, is not a requirement. Okay, we're not going to use that at all in this question because they're asking for takeoff mass, so we don't need to calculate the trip fuel whatsoever. That will be part of the landing mass calculation. Okay, so we basically go 1,764 over here, plus the 35, which is optional equipment, that's not part of the standard mass of the aircraft, plus the 300 for the pilot and the front passenger. And then you can see this passenger brought quite a lot of baggage, 350 pounds of baggage. And then we have 60 gallons of fuel in the aircraft tanks, so 60 times 6. Why times 6? Because we need to take gallons to pounds. And that gives us a total of 2,809 pounds as takeoff weight. Now, something that I picked up in this question, which you need to note, is that they actually did not include taxi fuel in this calculation. They should be giving you taxi fuel unless it's really like irrelevant to the weights that we're working with here, which is not normally the case. I mean, a small aircraft like this should be burning between 2 to 5 gallons of taxi fuel for the engine run-ups and taxiing. And especially if you're at a very big international airport and you're going to be waiting 20, 30, 40 minutes on the ground, you're going to be burning fuel on the ground, right? So that is something that they have not put in here. However, when you do these type of questions, I would strongly suggest just work with the information that they give you. That's the easiest and the best. We know that we should have taxi fuel in here, but they haven't given taxi fuel, and so what do we do? Okay, you answer the question according to the information that they give you. So in this case, £2,809. If you get a variation of this question and they do give you taxi fuel, then what we would need to do is we need to actually then subtract the taxi fuel. So if we say that we're going to burn, let's say 10 pounds of taxi fuel, we will subtract that from the 2809, and that'll give us 2799 pounds takeoff weight. The reason why we subtract taxi fuel is because, remember, from startup to where we are on the runway just before takeoff, we're going to burn that 10 pounds of fuel, which means the aircraft will be lighter by 10 pounds. Okay, that's why we subtract taxi fuel. In this case, not necessary. Okay, here comes a little bit more difficult one. So this question is, what is the maximum takeoff mass? Okay, MTOM, you obviously need to know your abbreviations as well. It might be MTOW as well, maximum takeoff weight. Okay, given in this question, MSTOM stands for maximum structural takeoff mass, MSLM stands for maximum structural landing mass, PLLM stands for performance limited landing mass. Okay, let me just quickly stop there. I want to quickly explain those to you. So if you look at an aircraft, we've basically got two limitations on takeoff and two limitations on landing. The structure of the aircraft, the way that it is built and how they've tested it, it can only take so much weight, right? The engines, the strength of the engines and the amount of, thrust that they produce, or whatever it is, power that they produce, whatever you want to call it, that plays a significant role in the amount of weight that an aircraft can carry during takeoff. But that is around the structure of the aircraft. So it cannot be heavier than that, because then it will, number one, not get airborne because it's too heavy, or number two, you might get issues, structural issues with the aircraft because it's overloaded. Okay, that's the one limitation on takeoff. The other limitation on takeoff that you have is sometimes an aircraft can structurally weigh 350,000 kilograms on takeoff. But you're operating out of a runway that is limiting you in terms of runway length. And the only way that we can then get out of that short runway is by reducing the aircraft's weight for takeoff. That is what we call a performance limited takeoff. So the aircraft as a structure, as a whole, can weigh, let's say, 350,000 kilograms during takeoff. The structure can take that. But because the runway is too short, now we need to reduce that to, let's say, 270,000 kilograms. Okay, because otherwise we're not going to be able to get airborne before the runway is finished. So those are the two limitations for takeoff. The one is structural, the one is performance limited. And on landing, it works exactly the same. So an aircraft that goes in for landing, obviously there's quite a bit of pressure on the undercarriage normally, when we put that big bird down on the asphalt. So typically there's a structural limitation, which is mainly around the gear and the wings of the aircraft, depending on how it's built. And that would be a structural limitation during landing. So there's a specific weight that you must always be at or below that for that aircraft to land within its structural limitations. Now, same applies to landing than what applies to takeoff. We might be flying from an airport that's got a massively long runway, okay? And we've got 4 kilometers ahead of us. So the aircraft can get airborne at 350,000 kilograms. But what happens if it's a short flight, so you don't burn a lot of fuel, and on top of that, you're going to an airport which has got a short runway. So now you can't necessarily be at your maximum structural landing mass during landing, because you might not have enough runway to be able to stop the aircraft before the end of the runway. So therefore we go then into performance limited landing mass. And each aircraft has got lots of graphs and diagrams and things, as well as the FMS, that can tell us these things. And we calculate all of these things obviously before takeoff and before landing, so that you know exactly what to expect and how many passengers you can load, how much baggage you can take, how much fuel you can take, and all these things. So those are the two limitations. Okay, so whenever you see structural takeoff mass or maximum structural takeoff weight, it's to do with the structure, and that is typically a higher weight compared to the performance one. It'll never be the other way around. Like, your performance weight will never be higher than your max structural, because the max structural that the aircraft can take is capped. Regardless of runway length, you cannot go higher than that. Same with landing mass. You're always capped at maximum structural landing mass. Regardless whether you're landing on a 10-kilometer runway and you feel that the aircraft can be as heavy as hell, like, there's a structural limitation. So those are always capped. The performance limited changes. The performance limited weight for takeoff and for landing changes depending on environmental factors like temperatures and runway length, braking coefficient, whether it's wet, whether it's dry, and lots of other factors as well. Okay, but that is what you need to understand for this question, because if you don't understand those limitations, you're going to struggle to figure out, okay, well, how do I calculate? Where do I even start with a question like this? Okay. So we've got our maximum takeoff, maximum structural takeoff mass there as 43,000 kilograms. Then we have our maximum structural landing mass as 35,000 kilograms. And then look there, the performance limited landing mass is 33,000 kilograms. So you can see you cannot be at your maximum structural landing mass in this case. You are performance limited. So it's probably going into a short runway or it's a very hot day or something, but you need to be 2,000 kilograms below your maximum structural landing mass because it's performance limited. Okay, then we have what we call maximum zero fuel mass. That's the maximum weight that the aircraft can be before you add usable fuel. Okay, why do we have this limitation? Think about it logically. Where are the tanks usually situated of the aircraft? It's inside the wings. Now, can you imagine you have the body of the aircraft or the fuselage just packed with baggage, packed with passengers, so you weigh like 350,000 kilograms just in the bloody fuselage of the aircraft, but then you take 500 kilograms or 1,000 kilograms of fuel in the wings. Like there's no weight in the wings then. And the wings are going to be so light that they can possibly, bend in the air and bend too much and it will go past the structural limitations of the aircraft. That's why we typically have a maximum zero fuel mass. So we don't overload the aircraft with passengers and baggage and then barely put in any fuel. There must be a balance between the weight in the wings of the aircraft compared to the weight in the fuselage and in the baggage hold of the aircraft. That's why we have maximum zero fuel mass, okay? So they cap you on how much passengers and how much baggage you can load compared to the amount of fuel that you have to take. Okay, that's basically what that is there for. That's max zero fuel mass. Then we have dry operating mass, which is 19,000 kilograms in this case. Dry operating mass, just aircraft on the ramp, no fuel in it, and basically just the necessary things to be able to operate the aircraft. So all the equipment that it requires and catering and. Okay. Total fuel capacity in this case 12,500 kilograms. That's the max that this aircraft can take. Our maximum trip fuel is 9,000 kilograms. Meaning we're not necessarily going to use any more than 9,000 kilograms. That's what they've calculated. Contingency fuel is 1,000 kilograms, alternate fuel 500 kilograms, and our final reserve fuel is 400 kilograms. Now, important, you have to understand that these three things at the end, contingency, alternate, and final reserve fuel, guys, that is not part of your trip fuel. Okay, trip fuel is not including your reserve fuel, contingency fuel, alternate fuel, and things like that. That is just to go from A to B. From takeoff, so when you open the throttle, to when you've landed and vacated the runway and you're in the parking bay, that is trip fuel. Diversions, alternates, extra contingency, things like that is not part of the max trip fuel mentioned in this question. That is super important to remember. Okay. So then, let's look at the answer question. So again, I've gone through a lot now, so I want to go back and read the question again, right? What do we need to calculate? It's asking, what is the maximum takeoff mass that we can be at? Now, before we start using the data, I want to remind you of these 4, or let's call it 6 things, okay? The very first one, or the very first 4, is you must always remember that you've got 4 limitations to determine. You've got 4 limitations to determine what can be your maximum takeoff mass, okay? The very first limitation is going to be your maximum zero fuel mass. Because, like I said earlier, you can't just load the aircraft with lots of passengers, lots of baggage, and then put no fuel in and then think, okay, well, I'm under the maximum takeoff weight, so I can go. No. There's a maximum zero fuel mass that you have to comply with. So that's always the first limitation that comes up. Think about it. The aircraft standing there in the parking bay, busy loading passengers, busy loading baggage. You also need to load fuel. So in your flight sequence, that's typically the first weight limitation that you're going to find is max zero fuel mass. The next one that you can get is then maximum ramp mass. Okay, now why is there a maximum ramp mass? Because for these massive aircraft, and also if you're operating from very busy aerodromes, sometimes it takes 45 minutes to an hour from when you've started the engines until the time that you get airborne. So if you've got 4 massive engines running, or even two big engines running, it's chowing fuel, right? Now, you don't want to use your trip fuel for operating on the ground before you're taking off, okay? Because you've calculated what is the trip fuel from takeoff to landing and parking in the bay. So taxi fuel can be a few hundred kilograms that you need to calculate before you take off, okay? So that's why we have a maximum ramp mass, and that is basically where the manufacturer tells us that this aircraft can weigh safely on the ground. After you've put passengers and baggage and fuel, it can weigh, let's call it 200,000 kilograms, okay, as an example. But maximum takeoff mass is, let's say, 190,000 kilograms. So like they give you 10,000 kilograms of taxi fuel. The amount that I'm mentioning now is probably way out. It can be, but what I'm trying to say is typically you can weigh more on the ramp compared to what you must weigh during takeoff, and that's because you have the taxi fuel allowance. Okay, so that's the second limitation. Okay, first limitation, max zero fuel mass. Second one is maximum ramp mass. So you've got the aircraft putting passengers, and before you put fuel, there's a limitation. Then the next limitation is now you add fuel. Where are we now? We're still on the ramp, but now we have a maximum weight that we're allowed to be at on the ramp. Then start the engine, start taxiing. Where's the next limitation in the sequence of our flight? It's during takeoff. So we need to be below a specific weight for takeoff. Now remember, we have two there, okay? And that's what I'm talking about here under number 3. So we have the structural limitation, okay, which is what the aircraft can weigh structurally at a maximum weight for that. Or it can be performance limited takeoff mass. And that can be because you're operating out of a short runway. So we need to keep those two things in mind. Okay, then, so that's the third limitation that you can have in your sequence of a flight. The fourth one then is typically your maximum landing mass. Okay, so that's MLM there. That can also be either structural or performance, right? Again, you can be a structural mass when you land, but the runway might be short enough. So in other words, you need to be below a specific weight for you to be able to land before you run out of runway. Okay, so those are typically the 4 limitations that you're constantly playing with. Okay, and what I like to do, and this is just personal preference, and after teaching thousands of students about aviation and how to pass their exams, and me flying myself, obviously we have very fancy systems to do this, but for the exams you have to know how to calculate this. And I have just found that I work from 1 down to 4. So I think about my flight sequence. Okay, where's the first limitation? It's maximum zero fuel. Second one, maximum ramp. Third one, maximum takeoff, split into 2, it's either structural or performance. Fourth one is landing mass, split into 2, it's either structural or performance. And I have that picture in mind, and whenever I get a question like this, I just run through those limitations. So I'll show you how I do that. The very first one, let's start with maximum zero fuel mass. Okay, so I want to go and calculate and make sure that I'm not going to exceed the maximum zero fuel mass by the amount of passengers and baggage, what we call payload, that I want to carry. So we know the little calculation that I've made here is 31,000, which is, here our maximum zero fuel mass. There we go. Okay, so it's 31,000. And then I subtracted 19,000, which is our dry operating mass. Why do I do that? Because that gives me a good indication. Remember, dry operating mass is what the aircraft is weighing without payload. It's basically standing there with all the necessary equipment, not necessarily fuel for the trip, all the necessary equipment, crew, and their baggage and so on. So if I take the aircraft standing there and I subtract that weight from the maximum zero fuel mass, then the difference that I get is how much payload I can put on the aircraft before I exceed the maximum zero fuel mass. Okay, so in this case, my dry operating weight is 19,000 kilograms. My maximum zero fuel mass is 31,000. So therefore, I've gone 31,000 minus 19. And that gives me a total of 12,000 kilograms. Maybe I'm going to start using some other color here. Okay, so that's 12,000 kilograms, which means that I can take a total of 12,000 kilograms in payload. I cannot take more than that, because if I put 13,000 kilograms of payload in the aircraft, it will be 19,000 kilograms that the aircraft is weighing currently, plus I add 13,000 kilograms on top of that, and that'll give me 32,000 kilograms, which is exceeding the maximum zero fuel mass, and I can't be, so I'm limited there to 31,000. So I cannot add more than 12,000 kilograms of payload. Done, finished. There's no debate around that. Okay, so now I figured out, okay, I know that payload, the max payload that I can take is 12,000. So we keep that in mind for our takeoff mass calculation. Then the second limitation, if we go here on my little diagram, is maximum ramp mass. Okay, now we're going to add fuel. Now you'll see if you look at the information that they've provided, they haven't given us a maximum ramp mass. Okay, so that means if we don't have the info, we can't work with it, so we just leave that. So we then safely assume that the maximum ramp mass is good. Then we get to our maximum structural takeoff mass. That's the third limitation. It's this one over here in the sequence, right? Maximum structural takeoff mass. So now what do we do now? Now we take our dry operating weight, which is the 19,000 kilograms, plus 9,000 kilograms, which I can remember was our trip fuel. Okay, so fuel we need from going from A to B, takeoff to landing, plus 1,000, which was, let's see, our contingency fuel. So I've added this 1,000, plus I've added the alternate fuel, plus I've added reserve fuel as well. Why did I add all these figures to our dry operating mass? Well, it's because we need this fuel inside the aircraft tanks, right? So if we take our dry operating mass, that's the aircraft with the crew, their baggage and all the necessary equipment to operate, plus if we add fuel, now the aircraft's fully ready for the trip, but we haven't obviously added any payload yet, okay? So if I look at adding all these different things, so it's 19,000 plus the 9,000 plus the 1,000 plus the 500 plus the 400, which is all fuel, then you'll see that gives me a total of 29,900 kilograms. Okay, that is the structural mass that I'm going to be if I take the aircraft dry operating mass plus fuel. I haven't added payload. So now if we take the 29,900 kilograms, we know that we can weigh, according to the maximum structural takeoff mass, 43,000. It's here in the question. There it is. Okay, we can weigh 43,000 kilograms during takeoff structurally. And you can see if I've just added all the fuel to the aircraft, I get 29,900 kilograms. So if I do the math, if I go 29,900 kilograms, okay, plus 12,000 kilograms. Why do I add the 12,000? Because that's what I calculated is my maximum payload that I can add. Otherwise, I'll exceed max zero fuel mass. So we've already worked with that limitation. We've dealt with it. We don't have to remember about it because we know it's 12,000. So now I take the weight of the aircraft plus the fuel, plus structurally what I'm limited in terms of max zero fuel mass. So therefore I go 29,900 plus 12,000, and that gives me a takeoff weight of 41,900 kilograms. Okay, so you can see if I add the 12,000 kilograms of payload that the max zero fuel weight says I can take, then I'm well within the 43,000 kilograms that I can weigh structurally for takeoff. Okay, so this limitation is okay. We are within limits here. Okay, now the next thing in the sequence is going to be our maximum structural landing mass. Okay, so we've dealt with maximum structural takeoff mass. Oh, by the way, you'll see in the question that didn't give us a maximum performance takeoff mass. They only gave us a performance limited landing mass. Okay, so we can then just deal with a maximum structural takeoff mass. We don't have to keep performance limitations in mind. Otherwise, you'd have to go and calculate that as well. Okay, so the next one we need to look at is maximum structural landing mass. So structurally, what is the max that we can weigh during landing? So that then comes down to 43,000 minus 35,000. Why is that? So I took the maximum structural takeoff mass that we can be, okay, 43,000, and I subtracted the maximum structural landing mass that we can be, which is 35,000, and they gave that to us here. So there's maximum structural takeoff mass, and there's maximum structural landing mass. So 43,000 minus 35,000. Why? Because I want to go and determine how much fuel can I take before I exceed, how much fuel should I burn? Apologies. How much fuel should I burn before I exceed my maximum structural landing mass? Because if I weigh 43,000 kilograms during takeoff, okay, and I know I'm not allowed to be heavier than 35,000 kilograms during landing, then I need to know what must I burn on the flight from takeoff to landing. And in this case, it's 8,000 kilograms. Okay. Now, we know that according to the question, we are going to burn 9,000 kilograms of fuel. So we're going to burn more than what the limitation is for us. So in other words, the max trip fuel is 9,000 kilograms, which means that we're actually going to be landing at a weight of 34,000 kilograms. And clearly you can see that the maximum structural landing mass was 35. So we are 1,000 kilograms below the maximum structural landing mass. So we're good to go. So if this was the scenario, then we are good. But there's one little problem here. Okay, they gave us another limitation, which was the performance limited landing mass. So if you look at the question, you can see our maximum structural landing mass. Let me just get a different color here. The maximum structural landing mass is 35,000 kilograms. But here, performance limited, we must be 33,000 kilograms. Okay, so it's 2,000 kilograms lower than our maximum structural landing mass. So now in this case, what's going to happen is we're going to take 43,000, almost a similar little calculation to what we did earlier, 43,000, and now we subtract 33,000 because that's the performance limited landing mass. So what we're looking at now is we're saying, okay, we're taking off at 43,000 kilograms maximum structural takeoff mass, and we need to be landing, because of performance limitations, we need to be 33,000 kilograms during landing or less. So if we go 43 minus 33, you can now see that it's saying, hey, we need to burn at least 10,000 kilograms of fuel during this trip. Otherwise, we're not going to be 33,000 kilograms when we land. Now, the max trip fuel is 9,000 kilograms, right? So we're only going to be burning 9,000 kilograms during this trip, which means that we are left with 1,000 kilograms of fuel too much, and we're going to exceed the performance limited landing mass. Okay, so in other words, if we take off at 43,000 kilograms and we only burn 9,000 kilograms, then you'll see I did the math here, then we're going to be landing at 34,000 kilograms max, or not max, but landing weight. And you can see performance limited is 33,000, so we need to lose 1,000 kilograms somewhere. Okay, so how do we do that? Well, we just need to reduce our takeoff weight. We can't burn more fuel, we just need to weigh less before we take off. So by how much? By 1,000 kilograms, because currently with this calculation we're going to be 34,000 kilograms when we land, but we're limited to 33,000, and so therefore we need to come down by 1,000 kilograms on our takeoff mass, which is 43,000. So then it's simple. You take 43,000 kilograms minus the 1,000 kilograms, and now you know you can't be more than 42,000 kilograms for takeoff, and in this case it's C, so that is the correct answer. Okay, now to be honest with you guys, I mean, it took me some time to explain this one, right? Now I can probably, because I've done this thousands of times, I can probably do this little calculation in 2 to 3 minutes. Not to brag, but to tell you that the more you're going to do these things, the quicker you're going to pick up on the limitations. If I read this question, okay, I could have probably immediately told you that the limitation is going to be with a performance limited landing mass. Okay, I just get a feeling for it because I've looked at these numbers thousands or hundreds of thousands of times. So all I can tell you with a question like this is practice makes perfect, but you've got to have a little formula, okay? And if I can tell you something, use this little formula and keep this in mind. First limitation, second limitation, third limitation, fourth limitation. And number 3 and 4 is split into 2. It's either structural or performance limited. And if you do that, you will never get these questions wrong because you're following a little formula. Okay, so that's how I like to do it. Then the next question is given maximum structural takeoff mass 7,400 kilograms, maximum structural landing mass 7,400. So you can see this aircraft can actually take off at its maximum weight, and then it can land again at its maximum takeoff weight. Basically, it's the same thing, right? So you don't have to dump fuel or anything before you have to do an emergency landing straight after takeoff. Then zero fuel mass, in this case 5,990 kilograms, taxi fuel 15 kilograms. Something that I pick up here is you can see that most of these figures that I'm reading to you now is all in kilograms. Guys, be careful in the exams, okay? Sometimes they might give you something in pounds or something like that. Make sure that you do the conversions, okay? Make sure that all of your units are the same. That is super important. Don't get caught out like that. Don't just read the question quickly and then just jump in. Read slowly and make sure all your units are the same. So taxi fuel 15 kilograms, contingency fuel 110, alternate fuel 275, final reserve fuel 250, and trip fuel 760. Remember, very important, the taxi fuel to the final reserve fuel, that section there, is not part of your trip fuel. Trip fuel is separate. It's from opening the throttles to after landing closing the throttles. That is what trip fuel is, okay, and parking in the bay basically. So that's what we call trip fuel. So these other figures are not part of trip fuel. Now the question is, what is the expected landing mass at destination? Okay, now this is actually a very simple question and a very simple calculation, because you can see your maximum takeoff mass and your maximum structural landing mass is the same at 7,400 kilograms. Okay, so if we weigh 7,400 kilograms during takeoff, we know we can land at 7,400 kilograms as well, so there's no limitation to keep in mind for the landing. Okay, so then 7,400 kilograms is what we're going to be when we take off. Okay, now what do we start, they're asking for expected landing mass. So if you think about it, if you weigh X amount during takeoff, then how do you calculate what is your landing mass? You're going to subtract the taxi fuel and you're going to subtract your trip fuel. But the catch here is that if you don't know that taxi fuel is not part of trip fuel, you're not going to subtract it, and there will be an answer which does not have taxi fuel calculated for, and then you're going to pick the wrong answer. Okay, so that's a little trick here with this one. It's a super simple question, but you can get it wrong if you don't understand the theory. So in this case, it's 7,400 kilograms takeoff weight. We subtract 15 kilograms. Why? Because that is our taxi fuel. Okay, and then we also subtract 760. Why? Because that's our trip fuel. Okay, so we burn taxi fuel, we burn trip fuel, and then we land, and that gives us a total of 6625. Oops, I didn't put kilograms in. 6625 kilograms, and you can see in this case the correct answer then is A. Okay, simple one. I think this is the last one. Yep. So if you've been giving me your attention up to now, it means I've done a good job, hopefully. So this is the last one. Given 3415 pounds is our dry operating mass, DOM, 400 pounds trip fuel, 600 pounds passenger mass, 1050 baggage, 5850 is maximum structural takeoff mass. Ooh, and look at this. 5,200 pounds is our maximum performance takeoff mass, MPTOM. Okay, so you can see we have two limitations here. Because of the short runway or the temperature outside, we have to be 650 pounds less or below our maximum structural takeoff mass because we're performance limited. So we can't load the aircraft to what the structure of the aircraft can take, because in this scenario we're limited with performance. So now the question then is, the traffic load is to be reduced to bring the takeoff mass into the regulated takeoff mass limits by, and then it gives you the amount that you need to reduce your traffic load with. Okay, now what is traffic load? In this case, it is going to be your passengers, your passenger mass and your baggage mass. So in other words, if you go and calculate the passenger and the baggage mass as it is right now, you will get a figure for takeoff, and we just need to reduce that figure and compare. Or you get the figure first, see is it within the maximum structural takeoff mass? Yes, it is. And then you also compare it with, is it within the maximum performance takeoff mass? If it isn't, then you can see the difference, and then you know by how much you must decrease your payload, okay, or traffic load. So those are the two limitations we're sitting with. I've put them here. It's maximum structural takeoff mass and maximum performance takeoff mass. So the only thing that we need to do here is let's just go and calculate with the figures that they've given, how much do we weigh? Because if we've got that, then we're good to go. Then we can see, are we overweight or are we actually good to go? Okay, so what do we do to get takeoff weight? We take our dry operating mass, which is 3415. Let me change colors here again. 3415. And then we add 400. Why? Because that is our trip fuel. We need to add that to our takeoff weight. Then I've added 600. What is that for? That's our passenger mass. And then 1050 I've added as well. Why? Because that's our baggage. So we've added the trip fuel to the dry operating mass. Then we've added the passengers. And then we've added the baggage. Okay. That gives us a total mass of 5,465 pounds. Now it's simple. We know that the figures that we've used, that they've given us, we know what that is going to be in terms of the takeoff weight. So that's the takeoff weight of the aircraft with the figures that they've given us. Okay, but we have two limitations for takeoff. It's structural and it's performance. So the structural one is 5,850 pounds. That's the max that we can be. The performance one is 5,200 pounds. Now you can see we're currently weighing 5,465. So are we within limitations for structural? Yes, we are. Okay, but are we within limitations for performance takeoff mass? No, we are not. That's a problem. By how much are we overweight? Well, it's simple. We just take the figure that we've just calculated now, this one here, and we subtract the amount that we can be added as a maximum for performance, and that difference is 265 pounds, which means that the correct answer in this case is D, And from a practical point of view, it means that you need to go to your trip fuel or your passengers and baggage, and you need to somehow lose 265 pounds between those things. It's going to be difficult to do it with trip fuel because the fuel is the fuel you need to get from A to B. You'll probably have to chuck out some passengers and baggage. So these are the decisions that pilots have to make. So yeah, I mean, now we've done 4 questions. Guys, I mean, if you like this video and you found it helpful, we do have an online ground school course with some really amazing content. I mean, this is just a drop in the bucket of what we give on the online ground school course. So below this video, there is a link. You can book in a free demo with myself or one of my team members. We'll show you the course. We've helped a lot of student pilots throughout the years, more than 2,500-3,000 student pilots to pass their flying exams. We've put more than 7,500 exams through our system. So we've got a lot of data, and that's why we know these things, right? So if you feel that you need help with your flying exams, click the link below, book a free demo with us. There's no strings attached. We'll show you the system. We'll show you what we have. But if we can help others, then we can help you. And yeah, if you found this helpful, share it with a friend, tag a friend, make a comment, tell me what other videos you would like to see, and then I'll see if I can put something like this together to help you guys even more. So thanks for watching, and then hopefully see you on a demo call with us.